Nilisema mwaka wa 98 kwamba nitajiuzulu ama nitastaafu kipindi hiki cha miaka 5 ikiisha. Wengine hawakuamini kwa sababu wanaamini power katika kontinenti la Afrika, kwamba kuna mtu anaweza kuwacha power ya urais. Power iko kwa wananchi, na sisi tu ni wadhamini yao. Na ndio nataka kuambia wananchi wetu wanaotafuta democracy, tafadhali muwe na principle ya kuamini yale mnayoamini. Haiwezekani kiongozi kuruka hapa, kesho anaruka hapa, kesho anaruka hapa. Iwe unaamini kwamba naingia chama cha KANU kwa sababu gani? Uingii tu kwa sababu ni chama cha KANU. Lazima kuangalia kwa makini mwongozo wa KANU ni nini. Na unasema chama hiki kinanifaa na nitakaa hapo hapo. Kukiwapo nini? Hiyo kitawasaidia. Nasema haya kwa sababu nitaondoka kwa siasa ya moto. Mimi kwa raia mwema. Lakini wale wanaozingatia kuongoza, msiweke Kenya chini. Msiweke msingi wa siasa zenu kwa chuki. Kama yuko mtu ametukana mimi, namsamehe. Na kama yuko mtu ambaye nimesema chochote ambaye kimeumiza roho yake, unisamehe.
Well, and that is, of course, a throwback soundbite there from former Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi on his last Jamhuri Day address as head of state back in the year 2002. A lot of change, of course, in the political scene since then. Now, 30 years ago, the leader of Burkina Faso's revolution, Thomas Sankara, was cut down in a hail of bullets, a bloody end to a turbulent yet charismatic life that has gained cult status in Africa. The young army captain who took power in the deeply poor nation in 1983 has been nicknamed Africa's Che Guevara, a moniker that reflects his anti-imperialist convictions almost as much as the way he died. Our regional affairs reporter Trixie Ngado with the life and times of Sankara.
Born on the 21st December 1949, Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara wore various caps throughout his short but impactful political career. Marxist, Pan-Africanist, military captain and president for a short but historic 4 years. The young leader took power in a bloodless coup in 1983 alongside childhood friend Blaise Compaoré. The revolutionary leader kicked off sweeping reforms that included reversal of structural societal inequities, championing local production and consumption of Burkina Faso-made goods, kicking off an anti-corruption campaign that weeded out corrupt leaders, shunned imperialism, promoted women's rights and economic independence. At a time, many African leaders danced to the beat of self-serving former colonial powers. It was during these early days in power that Sankara gave Burkina Faso, previously known as Upper Volta, its name, meaning land of upright men. It was during his brief 4-year stint as president of Burkina Faso that a trailblazing Sankara made food security, infrastructure, health and economic independence a priority, making 2 meals a day a priority for all, ensuring vaccinations that ensured the country was pandemic-free and marshaled civil participation in building of country's infrastructure. He also banned the use of luxury cars by government ministers, selling off all Mercedes-Benz formerly owned by top government officials, and forbidding first-class flights for officials leaving the country. Top government officials were also not exempt from farm work, graveling roads and building railway tracks. The radical reforms were not just restricted to other government officials, his only prized possessions being his vehicle, 4 bicycles and 3 guitars. Sankara met his untimely death along 2 other government officials when gunmen showered them with bullets and was speedily buried in an unmarked grave. His wife and child fled the country shortly after. Many to this day speculate that Sankara suffered the nasty fate under the hands of lifelong friend and now deposed Burkina Faso leader Blaise Compaoré. Compaoré assumed leadership of the country of Burkina Faso for the next 27 years. 30 years after the assassination of Africa's very own Che Guevara, the mystery of who killed Thomas Sankara lingers on. His body was recently exhumed as part of investigations into the shock assassination. Trix Ingado, KTN News.
Many thanks, Trix Ingado, for that comprehensive report. Of course, the question remains, who killed Thomas Sankara? Answers are still being searched for. And at WT, where Yigeze, one of our viewers here, says on Twitter, Thomas Sankara is an icon for Africa's new generation. He gave us a roadmap of how to lead for our people, not for our own stomachs. He puts imperialists in their own place, although the same assassinated him. His legacy lives on. His revolution was genuine. And now, in studio to discuss Africa's governance post-Thomas Sankara, I'm now joined by Nerima Wako, who's the Executive Director, Siasa Place, as well as Mark Bichachu, who's a political analyst, and Dr. George Mbenzi is going to shortly join us all the way from Hong Kong. He's a governance expert. Good evening, gentlemen and lady, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Nerima, let me start with you. I don't know if you were there when Thomas Sankara was murdered in the year 1987, but I'm sure you've read history. So which kind of a leader was he? And do you think African leaders at the moment should emulate what he did?
Well, thank you for having me, Yusuf. No, I was not there. However, according to the history, he's...
So my guess was right.
Your guess was right. But I do know my history. And Thomas Sankara is one of the leaders in Africa who's looked up to completely. For a leader who only led for 4 years, at the age of 34 years old, he understood the meaning of corruption and what it does to our continent. And for him to be able to, within that time frame, even eradicate diseases such as malaria and receiving an award from the World Health Organization. And not only that, having Burkina Faso, first and foremost, a name for themselves. For he was one of those leaders who said, we're going to call ourselves the upright man, the country of the upright man. And he was also able to have his people believe in self-sustainability within that time frame. And that's very important. It's essential. And he was also talking to the people about...
Born on the 21st December 1949,
two meals a week. So that's something that in Africa we haven't even seen with our current leaders. And he's one of those who believed in the sacrifice, and not only understanding that sacrifice in terms of women leadership as well, and seeing the futuristic vision of Burkina Faso.
Clearly, you've read a lot about Thomas Sankara. There's something that, you know, we're calling also for the current batch of African leaders to read about. Now, Mark, this is a man who has become some sort of a blueprint for African leadership. And he wasn't even democratically elected. I mean, so what does this say?
You know, one of the things, Yusuf, that is true about the world today is that anything that is not Western is considered evil. Africa has been banned from creating its own solutions, and we've been limited to copying from the West. And I just want to draw a contextual picture for what Thomas Sankara had to go against. And for the viewers, I brought a note from a trip I took down to French-speaking West Africa. This is a 500 francs note. CFA. This is an inheritance, by the way, from the French. And for 8 African countries in West Africa, their currency is controlled by France. Not only is their currency controlled by France, but their politics is controlled by France. And further to that, they are not even allowed to mine their own natural resources without the say-so of France. Much of their military is overpowered and overshadowed in country. by the French military. Again, if you look at throughout French-speaking Africa, all the way from Congo, you go to the Central African Republic, Rwanda, Burundi, and all the way to Senegal at the farthest west side of Africa, you'll find that every French-speaking African country has suffered more than one coup, still suffers extreme poverty. What does that tell you? That Sankara stood up against an imperialist France that wanted to influence the poverty of Africa, the ignorance of Africa, to advance its Western ideals. Now, what Thomas Sankara did, and what is considered evil, is he stood up for Africa on the shoulders of Africans. He shut out the IMF. He said, you know what, we are not going to beg for food anymore. We are going to produce it ourselves. And he was able to do that.
And Mark, we're seeing a situation where in Cameroon the country is sharply divided, not because of other issues, basically because of language. There are those who want to speak French and there are those who want to speak English, apparently.
Now, the thing is, and I'll remind you what Paul Kagame did in Rwanda. When he did the switch from French to English, you need to understand that the French-speaking countries are still under influenced and neo-colonialist tendencies. And I'll tell you why. The French control who is in power to this day. Some of the heads of states of West African countries receive their orders directly from Paris. And this is a problem because Paris believes in protecting the bourgeoisie while forcing down the hoi polloi. That's what they do. That is their system of governance.
Yes. Now, Nerima, this is where I want to bring you in. Do you agree with Mark that it's about time that Africa shrugs off or, bashes off this kind of Western ideologies? And does Africa even have its own democracy, basically?
Well, that's an interesting question that you ask me, because when we look at the different ways that Africa has been colonized, for instance, the French believed in assimilation, which is what they did in Burkina Faso, which was you were practically a French citizen, and they made sure that the African citizens emulated French culture. So in 1945, we had some members of parliament in France who were originally from Benin or Burkina Faso representing Africa in the French parliament. However, for British colonialists, they believed in terms of Africans always have this culture of being ignorant and almost treated as children. They always need leadership and direction, but there are different types of leadership that they used. If we look at Nigeria, for instance, it was indirect leadership, and if we looked at Kenya, it's direct. That's why when you look at even the way our parliament looks, or some of our culture, for an instance, it looks like a replica of England, UK, of London. But when you go to Nigeria,
Nerima, what is the alternative? What other options do Africa or does these African countries have?
I think it's using our own methods or a mixture of both. And I think that Burkina Faso is a prime example, because when Thomas Sankara went into power, he believed in using chiefs and understanding what happened within the community. I want to say that currently we don't rely on chiefs as much as we used to in the past. And chiefs are such an integral part of our own culture. So it's being able to use our traditions and our culture and also combining it with Westernization. We can find our way or synergy to compromise.
Let me now link up with Dr. George Mbezi, who's joining us from Hong Kong via Skype. Good evening, Dr. George. It's good to have you on the show, and we're talking about, Africa's governors post the late Thomas Sankara. And if you look at some of his achievement, if you look at some of his priorities, was food security, infrastructure, health, economic independence. So this is a man who had all the qualities of, good leadership. So our discussion is, this is a leader who is not even a product of democracy in the first place. So does it mean Africa can get this kind of leaders, not necessarily through democracy?
Well, thank you for inviting me to the show. One of the things about Sankara that I've come to love was he looked at transformation of an economy, changing how people viewed themselves, their lifestyles. And his biggest challenge was corruption. When he was able to slay the corruption, the snake, he was able to begin to bring his country to a place where they could actually focus in alleviating things like hunger, upgrading education, and healthcare reforms. His vision for Burkina Faso is almost in line with what we've seen President Kenyatta and his administration try to do. In the first 4 years of his presidency, he is a president who has actually moved so fast under the new constitution and begin to drive the rail from Mombasa to Nairobi, healthcare, electricity for the people. And then I sit back and I look at President Kenyatta and I go, here is one of the first African leaders who came into power not to make money, but to make a difference for his own people. And this is the kind of a leader that Sankara was. And I sit back and I wonder if a president like Kenyatta could get another 4 years. Sky's the limit.
I'm sure, Dr. George, I'm sure the members of the opposition will not take that lightly, even now, as the country prepares for that October 26th presidential election. We're not quite sure if that election, if it's going to take place. So, are you trying to compare the current president, that is President Uhuru Kenyatta, to Thomas Sankara?
Very much I'm trying to. And I'm saying this as a policy analyst. I've looked at the last 4 years in the Kenya's journey. Look at the changes, the speed the constitution has brought the country of Kenya. No other African country, and let me try this again, no other country in the world has actually attained what Kenya has attained in the last 4 years. And it's been driven because you had a leader whose commitment has not been to make money for himself, but build his own country. The vision of Sankara was what? Economic policies that were geared towards fighting corruption, building agriculture, healthcare.
Yes, Dr. George, but critics might say, you know, in Kenya, we've not seen any sort of high-level prosecution when it comes to corruption. There's no respect for independent institutions. Case in point, the current electoral body. So there are those who might not agree with your notion, you know, of comparing the current president of Kenya to Thomas Sankara.
And, you know, I respect them all. But even when you look at the opposition very closely, no one can point a finger and say there is a president who's corrupt. They know very well. And I'm not trying to drum up support for President Kenyatta. As a policy analyst living in North America, I'm looking at an African leader who is actually in the process of transforming a nation and a region. Kenya has become kind of a beacon for East Africa. We always say when Kenya sneezes, the whole region gets a cold. It's very true because as a stable income, middle income economy, the gains that Kenya has experienced in the last 4 years do not match even when you take the first three presidents of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, Daniel Arap Moi, and Kibaki. Those three combined have not come close to what President Kenyatta has done.
Now, Mark, you've talked about, you know, African countries still under the powers of these you know, their big brothers, should I say, the likes of France, Britain, and all this. So one might ask, if not democracy, what is the other alternative that you're talking about?
I want to take you back to the history of the world a little bit, and I'll take you to the 1980s and 1990s when there was a big debate between communism, socialism versus capitalism. Now, we in Africa were totally ostracized for practicing any form of socialism or indeed communism. However, no one speaks about the Schengen countries, Finland, Netherlands, and all these countries that practice hybridized socialism. They practice socialism within a capitalist system. How do you call it socialism? Their healthcare is absolutely free. Their education is free. So what have these countries done that Africa has not been able to do is they've not allowed Africa to develop its own solutions to its own problems. Africa needs a situation where our political environment is not modeled after the States, it's not modeled after Britain, but it's modeled for Africa and in keeping with African values and the direction that Africa wants to go. Every time Africa tries to do anything different, you will see the West quickly come in and say, you know what you're doing is not right. But the reality of the matter, there's no single democracy, even in the West, that resembles the other. Let's look at at, for example, the United Kingdom. Their head of state has not changed 25 years before I was born and 33 years after I was born. It's still the same head of state. They keep changing the prime minister. Why don't they complain about that? The issue is this, that the reality of the matter, Africa needs to wake up to the reality of what the Chinese tigers, the Asian tigers figured out, and what much of Arabia figured out. That it is our problem, we need our solutions, and how do we get those solutions? We need to look forward and ask ourselves, what do we as Africans want? Which is what Sankara was able to do. In the absence of money to build a railroad, he sat down and you said, what? Let us volunteer and let's build the railway ourselves. And that's what we need, homegrown solutions.
And Mark, from your conversation, you're bringing one president to my mind, that is Rwanda's President Paul Kagame. And of course, he's going to roll up to, I don't know, 2020-something. He changed the constitution through a referendum. We've seen the development record he has in Rwanda, but still, people are still criticizing his leadership, his track record, rather, in Rwanda. There are those who are saying that it cannot be sustainable.
You know, the thing is, and we've had this debate before on the show, and I said if it works like a duck and talks like a duck, then it's most likely a duck. What does that tell you? Paul Kagame's test will come at the handover stage. If he's able to hand over, he'll have succeeded. If he holds on to power, he will have failed. And what does that tell you? It tells you that in Rwanda today, if you look at the economic indicators and every other indicator of progress, then you have a country that's moving forward. What is lacking is the sense that he does not face any opposition, because the feeling is that he's clamping down on opposition. Now, whether he's able to hand over this mantle, and you just played a clip of President Moi, and I never missed Moi until now, because he said exactly what we needed to say about Kenya, that the moment a leader is able to hand over, then they cement their place in history as people who've done the right thing for their countries.
So you're going to judge his leadership record when it comes to handing over power, but not now?
Absolutely.
Okay, Nerima, what do you have to say about that?
I think Mark has very interesting perspectives. And just recollecting, I have friends who are Rwandan, and when you're asking about Kagame, some will say, well, you know, it's lack of freedom. We don't have freedom of information or assembly, and our human rights are being violated. And then you talk to another group of Rwandese who tell you, well, it's the best thing for this country. Quite frankly, what's going to happen after? What's going to happen next? We'd rather have somebody who has this stern authority over us, and then when we figure out who's going to take over that leadership, then we can understand. However, we can look at countries even like Germany, for instance, where Angela Merkel, you know, there she is, another 4 years, and the longest-serving chancellor has been there for 16 years, and nobody said a thing about it. But when we look at their type of governance, when we look at the Bundestag, they are able to have not only an opposition, but also minority political parties or minority groups represented within that party, just so because of World War II, they didn't want to go back into having a majority leadership that made decisions that not necessarily the majority of the population believed in. So it's about understanding what is best for our population, and every population has a different kind of leadership. We don't necessarily, as Africa, fall under complete democracy, which I quite think does not exist.
I would like to hear Dr. George Ibez's view on this. Dr. There are those, of course, who come from the school of thought that, you know, Africa should come with its own form of democracy that is going to be identified by the people on the ground and not necessarily copy-paste what comes from these Western countries. Do you agree with that?
I do agree. And I spent last weekend in Rwanda. I was in Kigali, and I walked around Kigali, and I went to Nakumatt. Now, Nakumatt in Nairobi has collapsed, but Kigali is thriving. And I remember asking some of the Rwandese a question: how come your economy is growing very fast? Because we in North America believe that in the next 5 years, Rwanda will actually be one of the second top countries in the East Africa region from an economic standpoint. But here's the thing. Western democracy does not work for Africa. When I hear the U.S. ambassador to Kenya or the British High Commissioner to Kenya telling Kenya, if you do this, we'll stop visas and that kind of nonsense. Well, it has to stop there. countries like Kenya are sovereign states. You cannot dictate to an African country that is sovereign, independent, that if you don't do this, we will punish you. The challenge with us, even in the diaspora, when we talk about Africa, or when we talk about Kenya, Uganda, we kind of take that stance like our Western friends, where we're telling Kenya, do this. We can do this. We can
but
change
Dr. George,
Kenya.
there are those who argue, there are those who say that the reason as to why Africa is getting some sort of, is being controlled by these Western countries is because of the sheer amount of aid that comes from these countries. Because with the aid also comes conditions.
Okay, look at Rwanda. When Rwanda was at the lowest, they were getting over 60% of aid. And President Kagame made it very clear to his people, he wanted to slow down the aid to Rwanda. I think Rwanda is now maybe only getting 20 or 25%. You see, the dependability on Western aid has got a way of enslaving people. In the next 5 years, Uganda is stable, Rwanda is stable, Tanzania is stable, Kenya is on the way there. I would bet that come January 2018, when all these 4 African countries are running at their top, oil is coming, agriculture is good, the next 5 years of these African states are going to be very strong. Why? Because we'll have stable leaders in the region. Stability of leaders trumps everything else that the Western would want to give us. When a nation can look at their leaders and say, we are glad where we are because we've got leaders that believe in us and leaders that are looking out for our best interests. I see that in Kagame, actually see that in Museveni, and more than ever, I see that in President Uhuru Kenyatta. Why? Because the democratic pace that Kenya has gained, and even look at ever since August 8th, he is a president who stepped back and let democracy play out.
But that doesn't beat the fact that the country is in some sort of a political crisis. Now, Mark, as you make your final comment, I'd like you to talk about Kenya, for example, and what do you think should be the way forward now?
Kenya is an interesting nation, and I have traveled quite a bit across Africa, and this is the one thing that I find quite interestingly different about Kenya. Kenya is the only country in Africa that is successful, and it's not successful because of mineral wealth, it's not successful because of vast amounts of resources found within its ground, but Kenya is successful because of its people. The biggest asset that we have in this nation is the people of Kenya. How do you know this? That in 2007, we went to the precipice, but in the year 2008, our GDP still grew by 6 percentage points. That tells you that the resilience of the Kenyan people is the hallmark of this nation. Therefore, there's been a lot of call for dialogue. This is what I'd like to tell the nation and Africa. Kenya does not need a dialogue between its leaders. It needs a dialogue between its people. It is the Kikuyu and the Kamba and the Luya and the Luo who need to sit together and agree and say, which nation do we need? Not which person do we need? Where are we going is the more important question than who is going to take us there. Because like Moses said, I might not get there with you. And let me tell you the truth, these leaders might not get there with us, but we will be there and we will make it. And what we need in this nation is a speech that gives us hope. The problem of building so much hardware and forgetting about building the hearts of a people is you build a nation that knows so much but feels very little.
I'm sure Kenyans have heard you loud and clear, Mark. That will serve as your final comment. Nerima, as you wrap up your final, as you give us your final comment, I'd like you to touch on, good governance and democracy. There are those who are saying it's different, but there some sort, they seem to have some sort of a symbiotic relationship. So what will you have to say about that? And moving forward, what needs to be done to make sure that, Africa gets some sort of good governance?
Well, for...
In 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, for democracy to work, of course, you need a representative who has your issues at heart. And that's where good governance comes in. Because once you have a good representative with your issues, then they're able to follow your policies within parliament. And that's good governance. However, one thing that I have to say out clearly is the fact that what's lacking in our country at the moment is public participation. As much as we see our political leaders going back and forth and bickering, what are we as a people doing about that? And we continue to support these very leaders as much as we know that they are corrupt, as much as we know that morally or ethically we would not agree with them in our own households, but then we choose to ask them to represent us as a country.
Well said, well said, Nerima. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. George, very briefly, a final comment before we wrap up.
I believe the best is yet to come for Kenya. We've got a strong opposition and a presidency, an administration right now that is very strong. I see a combination of a nation moving forward and one that's going to be the envy of the region and the world. And those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. George Benzi, coming to us via Skype all the way from Hong Kong. Is a governance expert. Mark Bichachi, political analyst, as well as Nerima Wako, is an executive director from Siasa Place. Many thanks, all of you, for your input. And finally, let's take a look at the proverb of the day. Of course, very quickly, on a Twitter poll earlier, we did ask you, is democracy a practical form of governance for Africa? 39% of you said yes, and 61% of you said no. Let me just go through only 2 comments here. And Miseri Cody says, I think this thing is foreign to we Africans and still remains foreign to us. And then Manuel says, Kenya is the best example of abused democracy. One final one. Democracy is pathetic. Believe in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. That is at Makamututa. Many thanks for your feedback there. And finally, here is the bottom line tonight. Africa's track record of governance since independence is at best mixed. Despite the moderate socio-economic and political progress made since independence, only a few countries have improved their performance relative to those in other parts of the world. Now, countless arguments have tried to explain Africa's lackluster development record. Some have blamed the continent's underdevelopment on geography, diseases, and the legacy of colonialism, while others basically think the dark continent tag has jinxed Africa. But here's the fact. At the heart of Africa's challenges lies poor governance, which has undermined Africa's socio-economic progress. Now, African governments have fallen short on their key obligations. African governments have failed to deliver on security, political participation, the rule of law, and ultimately sustainable economic opportunity and human development. Of course, this is why individual countries need to get on track with a simple solution that will address these challenges and deliver growth and development. And that is good governance. Of course, that is the bottom line tonight. Many thanks for watching. Remember, this program is aired every Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Until next week on Monday, bye-bye and enjoy the rest of the day.